Hello and welcome back to Biology 100. Today's lecture is going to cover the characteristics of living things. So today's lecture is divided into three parts. The first part will talk about levels of biological organization. We're then going to talk about the characteristics of living organisms. And finally, we'll talk about taxonomy or higher classification of living organisms. Okay, so here we are with the levels of biological organization going from very, very small and simple to very, very large and complex. So you are actually right here, you're an organism, but we're going to discuss each of these levels of organization. And when it comes time to an exam, you should be able to put them in the correct order and also give a definition for each. So let's start out with the atom. The atom is the smallest unit of an element that still retains physical and chemical properties of that element. So think about an element like gold. It's like lustrous, it's shiny. Theoretically, you could cut this down into smaller and smaller pieces, and if you could see an atom, which we can't, that atom would still retain some of those physical and chemical properties. But once we break that atom open into electrons and protons, it ceases to be gold. The next level up from atoms is something called a molecule. A molecule is a bond between two or more atoms to form something like what we have right here. So this is a good old water molecule, right? H2O, two atoms of hydrogen, one atom of oxygen. So some molecules are compounds, some are not. We'll talk about that. So a lot of the molecules we'll talk about this semester are things that make up biological organisms, such as carbohydrates, polysaccharides, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids. Okay, next up from molecules, we need to talk about organelles. So organelles are actually tiny little organs that we find inside of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells being like human cells and animal cells. Okay, so there are things like a nucleus, which we have up here, and the nucleus is the control center. And then of course we have our mitochondria, which are over here. These are our sort of powerhouse of the cell. So each one of these organelles has a slightly different job. And we're going to learn about these on our chapters on cells and tissues. Okay, next we get up to the cell. Now, you've heard of cells before. You've probably even looked at your cheek cells in lab. Well, the cell is the smallest unit of life that still can potentially display all those properties of life. Okay, usually cells are pretty darn small, and the reason is that small cells are better at getting stuff into and out of the cell than having a very large cell because of this ratio of surface area to volume. So small cells work better. So we have things like red blood cells all the way at this side tend to be very, very small, around 7 microns. The human egg is about 100 microns. But if you look at chicken eggs, they're huge. Okay, so for the most part, most cells are going to be very, very small. The only exception sometimes when we talk about eggs, which will divide mitotically to make a lot more smaller cells later on. Okay, and the next level up we have our tissues. Tissues are groups of similar cells that have a specialized function. For example, these cells right here to me look like they're pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells, and that's a mouthful, but we find those in the respiratory tract. So we have all different types of tissues in the body. We have connective tissues, epithelial tissues, which we find on the body surface. We have nervous tissue in the brain and spinal cord. And of course, we have muscle tissue that makes your joints move. So we'll talk all about tissues in a separate chapter. Okay, next up is the organ. An organ is the unit formed by two or more tissues, and this has a larger function than the tissues themselves. For example, the organ we're pointing to right here, what is that? That's a stomach. The stomach is a repository for food. It's where we store food. It's also where we begin digestion. So if we take a look at the stomach here, we can see that the stomach itself has several different layers of tissue in there. We have up top some epithelial tissue, some connective tissue. We have in there muscle tissue, which helps to move the stomach around. And of course, we have connective tissue as well, and even a whole lot of nervous tissue. You probably don't even know it, but your gut, that is your intestine and your stomach, actually have more nervous tissue than your spinal cord. Okay, now we're going to talk about organ systems. So this is the next higher level layer of complexity. So an organ system consists of two or more organs that are there to achieve a generalized body functions. So anytime you hear about the digestive system, we're talking about multiple organs, including the mouth for chewing, the stomach for digestion, the small intestines for absorption, and so on. So there's a lot of different organs and organ systems. For example, think about the reproductive system, which we're talking about down here. In males, this would consist of the testes, the scrotum, the penis, etc. In females, it would be the uterus, the vagina, the labia, all those different organs that are part of the reproductive system. And finally, higher up, the last level of organization when we get to you, is the organism. The organism contains multiple organ systems, right? You're made up of a digestive system, a skeletal system, a reproductive system, etc. So you contain multiple organ systems. Okay, now we're going a layer beyond you. So you are one person in a population, but a population is a group of individuals of the same species that occupy the same space and can potentially interact and reproduce with one another. So everyone in this lecture room is going to be of the same population. And then we get up to something called communities. So communities are all the organisms in a certain location, not just the humans, but even the sheep and the dogs. So you can see right here, this guy is carrying sheep and he's got a dog right there. So they're all part of one community. And then finally, we get something called the ecosystem. The ecosystem is all the organisms in a given area, as well as the biotic and abiotic factors with which they interact. For example, right here we have a coral reef, and think about what the organisms are. Well, first of all, those are the corals. The corals are actually animals. We probably have some fish in there as well. We probably have some other invertebrates. But then we have the abiotic factors. We have the water. We have the sand. All this contributes to the coral reef ecosystem. And finally, we have something called the biosphere. The biosphere is the entire portion of the Earth that is occupied by life. And it's actually a very small proportion of the Earth, but it's still amazing to see where we can find life on Earth. We found spiders that are sort of ballooning up at thousands and thousands of feet in the atmosphere. We can find bacteria and invertebrates, thousands of feet down in the Marianas Trench. So there are lots of places where we can find life, but if we look at the sum total area and volume of the Earth, it's actually a very small proportion of the Earth's volume. So this summarizes the different levels of biological organization, right? We started out up top there with our atoms, which was the smallest unit of an element that still retains the chemical and physical properties of that element. We went all the way through cells, we went through tissues, we talked about organs, organ systems, and eventually we got up here to the biosphere, which was that area of the Earth that potentially contains living life. Okay, now that we've covered the levels of biological organization, we're going to go through the characteristics of living organisms. And the first of these characteristics is they have a unique molecular composition. Remember, a molecule was a bond between two or more atoms that could be of the same element or different elements. And so the molecules that make up living organisms are things like proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. Now, individually, all of these are made up of the elements that we find in non-living structures as well, but they're arranged in certain ways that makes them unique to living things. The next characteristic of living organisms is, for the most part, they are composed of cells, right? When we talk about a human or a dog or an apple, it's all composed of cells. And cells are, again, the smallest unit of life that still display all the potential properties of life. There are two different groups of cells. We have prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So prokaryotic means before the nucleus, before, karyon meaning the nucleus and organelles. So here we're talking about things like bacteria, which don't really have a nucleus or anything inside. If we were to cut them inside or cut them open and look inside, we just see a bunch of cytoplasm and goo. And so all the DNA in there, it's still there, but it's not wrapped in the nucleus. And so that's why we call them prokaryotic. Now, everything else here is what we call eukaryotic. Eukaryotic cells are human cells and animal cells and most plant cells there. We're talking about something that has membrane-bound organelles. We can see a nucleus in there. We can see with electron microscopes that it has centrioles, and we can see mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, all that type of thing in there. So we have membrane-bound organelles, and these cells are much more complex than prokaryotic cells. Okay, our next characteristic of living organisms is that they require energy and raw materials. We call this metabolism. So metabolism is the sum total of chemical processes that occurs in a living being, which includes anabolism and catabolism. Now, anabolism is a building process where we take little small molecules and link them together to make larger molecules. Think of what this word sounds like. Anabolism, anabolic. Anabolic steroids you would take in order to build muscle mass. So anabolism here means to build. On the other hand, catabolism is the opposite. Catabolism is where we have a larger molecule, we break it down with enzymes, and in the process we break it down into smaller molecules and also release energy. So I think of like catabolism being like catastrophe, or what would happen if you put a bunch of cats in your bedroom and they would shred everything up. So cats tend to break things down into smaller pieces and they have lots of energy. Catabolism. So cellular respiration is an example of a catabolic process. We start out with a very large molecule up here, which is glucose, C6H12O6. We add some oxygen and it breaks down into a smaller molecule, water, plus carbon dioxide, plus the energy that's left over. So in this process, follow what happens to the carbons. On the left-hand side, you can see they're up there in the big sugar molecule, but where are the carbons in the right-hand side of the equation? They're up here in CO2. So every time you think about breathing out, what's coming out of your body, this carbon dioxide, those carbons just a few hours earlier were in the food that you ate, which is kind of gross when you think about you're breathing in other people's digested food. Ew. Okay, on the other hand, photosynthesis is an anabolic process. You know that photosynthesis happens in plants, and of course plants need water, they need carbon dioxide, and they need light. But using these three components, plants can actually generate a very complex molecule like glucose, which we have up here. So that's our glucose. And where did those carbons come from? Well, those carbons, again, came from carbon dioxide that was in the air. Okay, going one level further, we need to talk about autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms like plants which use light from the sun to generate their own food, to make glucose. Heterotrophs are organisms like you and your cat, which have to eat other organisms in order to get energy out. Okay, our next characteristic of living organisms is the ability to maintain homeostasis. And homeostasis is extremely important for your health. If you're not able to maintain homeostasis, you're dead. So, homeostasis here is the ability of an organism to maintain a relatively stable internal environment, even though the external environment might be fluctuating a lot. An example we talk about a lot in class is temperature regulation. And the way that your body regulates temperature is much like your house air conditioner regulates temperature. So imagine that you're in your house and you have this ideal temperature, let's say it's about 74 degrees. And if it gets too hot in your house, what's going to happen is that deflection away from the 74 will be detected by your thermostat, and it's going to turn on an air conditioner. Now, once the air conditioner turns on, it's going to bring the temperature back down again, and once it gets down to 74, it's going to turn off again. So ideally, if the air conditioner and thermostat are working properly, we're going to stay right in this narrow, happy range. Now, your body does the same thing. It's very excellent at maintaining homeostasis, right? Everybody knows that a normal human body temperature is 98.6 or 37 degrees centigrade. Now, what happens if we go out on a hot day and we start running around? Well, just like that dog up there, your temperature is going to want to elevate. Now, when that happens, your body wants to basically bring us back down to our set point. So one of the things that happens when you exercise and you begin to overheat is you begin to sweat. And sweat helps to dissipate that extra heat and release it away from the body. Now, by the same token, this doesn't happen a lot in Hawaii, but imagine you walk into a very, very cold room where the temperature is like 65 or 70 degrees. In that case, if your body temperature begins to drop, you're going to start to shiver. And that shivering actually generates a little bit of heat to help us from going too far down into the danger zone, right? We don't want to have a body temperature of 80 degrees. So ideally, this homeostasis uses mostly negative feedback to keep us in this happy zone of temperature. Suffice it to say that homeostasis is incredibly important in all the different body systems. Your body maintains homeostasis over blood pressure, over heart rate, over respiration rate, etc. So homeostasis is extremely important. If we don't maintain it, we die very, very quickly. So we're going to talk about homeostasis again and again throughout the semester. Anyways, our next characteristic of living organisms is the ability to respond to and modify their environment. So think about the way that plants modify their environment. Well, first of all, they grow towards the light, right? They go up where the light's going. They also will, break the soil and come up through the soil. And they will grow as light changes in direction. They can actually change the direction that the plant is tilting. Think about how things like beavers maintain their environment and modify their environment, right? We don't have beavers here in Hawaii, but they do modify their environment by building dams and things like that. And of course, humans really modify their environment, right? We always joke about over in Maui that the state bird is the crane, right? Because there's all these cranes up there and they're always modifying the environment. We're building hotels, we're building subdivisions, we're doing agriculture. So it's natural that we do modify our environment, but we have to be sure we don't do it in such a bad way that we destroy other organisms. So we have to think about that. Okay, our next characteristic of living organisms is the ability to grow and reproduce. Now you hear reproduction, you're like, all right, let's hear about that. Well, Before we get to the sexy sex stuff, a lot of reproduction that goes on in these smaller animals and protists is actually asexual, meaning we don't necessarily have sex going on. We can have a paramecium or an amoeba that simply just bloop, buds into two, and these two organisms are going to be genetically identical. Now that being said, if we go into higher organisms, we see a lot more sexual reproduction. That is where we have two different parents that are contributing different genes to that offspring. And we think the reason that sexual reproduction is more prevalent in the higher animals is that it allows us to recombine genes in order to do better with changing environments, that having two copies of each gene and having variation among these genes makes us more resilient to change and disease and things like that. So regardless of what type of animal or plant you are, right, there's going to be a male and a female that get down and do the dirty, and then we have a sperm coming from the male, and we have an egg coming from the female, and then we have the offspring that are going to be genetically different than their parents. They're going to have a combination of the genes of both the male and the female. Okay, once we have reproduction and once we have that fertilization of the egg, we then also have a process called development. Particularly in higher animals. If we're talking about a paramecium or something like that, okay, we don't. But if we're talking about a chicken or a person or even a fish, we have a fertilized egg, and that fertilized egg goes through this process of embryonic development till we end up with something like a blastocyst, and that blastocyst will eventually change and become an embryo and later a fetus. Okay, now our final characteristic of living organisms is that populations of living things evolve. And evolution is a hot word for a lot of people. There's some people, even here in Hawaii, that don't like to say evolution. They don't believe in it, and principally because they don't like to think that we come from apes, and we don't. We share a common ancestor, and we'll talk about that. So evolution, as I'm going to cover in this class, is a change in genetic composition of a population through time. So something as simple as that. A very microcosm of evolution I would give you is imagine we have 100 bacteria, and that among those bacteria there's only one that has resistance to the antibiotic tetracycline. Now if I treat that population with tetracycline, I'm probably going to kill off all the bacteria except for that one that was resistant. In that case, I have now just affected some evolution. I've changed the gene frequency in the population. Initially, the sort of tetracycline resistance gene was 1 in 100, and now it's 100% of the population. So this actually meets the definition of evolution, especially once that organism begins to reproduce itself and increase the numbers of tetracycline resistant bacteria. Okay, so that's just one example. Evolution often produces adaptations. These are the structural, functional, and behavioral features that contribute to the success of a species. Right, so think about what has contributed to the success of human beings. Well, first of all, opposable thumb, that's pretty big. Second of all, the fact that we have a pretty big brain and a big ability to think and do problem solving and things like that. So now we're going to talk about natural selection, which is still part of evolution. Natural selection is a mechanism by which populations may evolve. And we're going to give an example here. Over in England in the 1800s, there were two different morphs of this moth right here. And this is Biston betullaria. This is the peppered moth. And we've been talking about this for years now. And the different morphs were genetically determined, right? These were different genes that gave some a more peppered appearance and some a blacker appearance. Well, initially, back in the early 1800s, the peppered moth, this one with the sort of peppery morph, was more abundant. And the reason is because it blended better on the trees where there was lichens and stuff like that. The trees themselves, weren't that multicolored, but the lichens on there were, so it allowed these bugs, these insects, to fit in better and not be predated upon or eaten by birds. Now what happened during the Industrial Revolution is that all of a sudden we had all this soot being produced, and the soot changed the surface of the trees so where they were uniformly dark, and as a result, this moth, this morph, became more abundant due to natural selection. Any of these guys that were hanging around would easily be seen and picked off by birds, but the moths that were dark were more camouflage and were able to hide better from predators. So this is another example of evolution as occurring through the process of natural selection. Okay, we're going to end up this lecture talking about taxonomy or classification of life. Now, taxonomy is just the way that we classify biological organisms into different categories. You've probably done taxonomy when you go into a grocery store. Let's say your mom says, okay, you need to go get coffee filters, and you're like, okay, coffee filters are going to be by the coffee. Coffee is usually by the cereal, and so you kind of find the cereal aisle, and there's your coffee and your coffee filters. Well, biological taxonomy is a little bit different. That is, we classify things by their genetic relatedness. And so we have identified basically over 5 different kingdoms of life. And keep in mind that this kingdom down here needs revision. So kingdom Monera was originally the single kingdom we had for bacteria. These are prokaryotic organisms, right, that sometimes can cause disease, but now it's been broken into other groups. For example, archaebacteria and eubacteria. If we go up one level, we see something called Protista. Now, kingdom Protista includes single-celled organisms that are eukaryotic. So these are organisms like this paramecium here. So if you've ever been in science class, look through a microscope, you can see the little paramecium swimming around. It also includes things like euglenas and amoebas. And finally, the top 3 up top are the ones that we're going to talk about the most. These are the kingdoms that include the fungi, the plants, and also the animals. Okay, so starting with kingdom fungi up top, these are of course the funguses. And kingdom fungi includes eukaryotic organisms, that is organisms that have membrane-bound organelles. For the most part, many are multicellular when we talk about mushrooms and things like that. But keep in mind that we have fungi that are single cells too, right? Yeast are single cells. Without fungi, we wouldn't have mushroom pizza and we wouldn't have beer, which would be very, very bad. Okay, so another example of a kingdom here are the plants. Kingdom Plantae, these are eukaryotic, so membrane-bound organelles, but they're also autotrophic. They're able to generate their own food using sunlight and carbon dioxide. So we can find plants everywhere, right? You look outside, you see that there's coconut trees and palm trees and grass. These are all plants, and plants are absolutely necessary for the survival of animals, because animals, even if we don't eat plants, eat things that did eat the plants. Okay, so animals are humans and other organisms like that down below. So we are animals, and we are eukaryotic. We have membrane-bound organelles. We are multicellular, and we also are heterotrophic. Heterotrophic means we have to eat other things in order to survive, whether those are plants or other animals. Okay, you've reached the end of the lecture. Thank you for hanging out and learning about the characteristics of living things.